Hi, welcome to the GenAI Mastery Course. The goal of this course is to take you from a beginner GenAI user to an expert user in 7 sessions. My name is Lucky from GenAI. Let's dive in. Welcome to the first session of the GenAI Mastery Course. We are starting the course with the technical interaction and prompt engineering session. Being able to prompt GenAI tools properly will enable you to do the rest of the sessions effectively. My name is Lucky from GenAI and I'll be your trainer for this course. In this session, we are focusing on prompting GenAI tools effectively to enhance productivity. You need prompt engineering skills to be able to use GenAI tools effectively. Just a quick introduction here. The aim of this session is to move you from a basic GenAI prompter to an expert GenAI prompter. That is taking you from using generative AI tools like Google, Bing, search engine to writing prompts that are structured, logical, and can be repeated to create high quality content. I will just move on to the first part of the course. So in this session, you're going to develop several skills by the time you finish the session. The first skill area that we are looking at is you will learn how to use the PTCF framework to prompt generative AI tools effectively. And GenAI tools, they work excellently with structures and frameworks. You will also learn several skills like using delimiters, few-shot logic, chain of thought engineering, and red teaming. I will just explain what these are. Delimiters, they are characters or symbols that are used basically to create boundaries between different instructions that you are giving to generative AI tools. We're going to practice that and you'll see how that is. Few-shot logic is giving GenAI tools examples to follow, like tests or image to use for tone, character, or the output. Chain of thought engineering is training generative AI tools to follow specific steps that will help them create the intended content that you want. It's normally used for complex tasks. Red teaming is used to prompt generative AI in a way that they will be restrained to prevent them from hallucinating or exposing sensitive data or making up information. Hallucination is when generative AI tools make up information that do not exist. So these are some of the skills that you are going to develop in this session. But how would you know that you've been successful in the session, that you've developed those skills? The first part is the main one. It's one of the ways you measure whether you've been successful or not in the session. You will only need to edit less than 10% of the content you've created. Other ways you can check how much you've learned in this session or other success criteria are you'll be able to use chain of thought prompt to question generative AI content. For example, you can ask what is the source of the information, or if you're using data from the internet, that can be helpful. So you want the source. That way, generative AI would not make up information. Another area is the cross-platform agility. So you can adapt the same prompt for different generative AI tools because they have their different characteristics. So you know how to adapt prompt instead of just copying prompt across. You know how to adapt it to be suitable for that too. But with this, the more you work with generative AI tools, the more you know their differences. Another thing, the last thing is the risk mitigation bit, where you can control the information you use in generative AI tools, so you don't put personal information and other sensitive information. These are some of the success criteria. So let's dive into the first part of the course. The very first part of the course, we are looking at GenAI engineering. The key skill you're going to develop in this first practice is GenAI engineering. What is GenAI engineering though? It's not your typical engineering. It's just using a structure or a framework like the PTCF, which we're going to use now, to prompt generative AI tools for high quality content instead of basic prompts. And if you look here, we have a workplace scenario. Like I've said at the introduction, we have different scenarios that we're going to be using to prompt our GenAI tools that we're going to be practicing with. So we are practicing with this scenario that involves a project proposal from different notes. And we use that to learn how to prompt GenAI properly. There are several tools that you can use: Gemini, Copilot, ChatGPT, and so on. But we normally start with the pitfall, that is what not to do or how not to do it. If you look here, it's very basic. Write a proposal based on this note. It's like you're typing into Google. This is not how to use generative AI. And if this is done, these are the kind of things you'll find. The result, it will be generic in very simple terms. And what you are actually doing here, if you're not including enough details in a prompt, you are indirectly asking generative AI tools to hallucinate. You are saying make up information, fill in the gap. That's where things go wrong. That's where generative AI create content that you have to edit and fix and spend all the time. Whereas, how do you do it properly, which is the expert progression? PTCF, that's what we are starting with. You are expected to add more information to each step of the expert progression. We have basic information here because this is a course. We can't have all that information on here, but we give you something to start with, something to keep you going. We give you the main core, and then you can add that. For example, the first step is a persona. The persona is basically who is creating the content. On this occasion, we are looking at the project. That's why we have expert, project architect, and so on. So who are you? Who is creating the content? You want enough information to help generative AI create it from your own perspective as a persona. The second step should also be more specific about the task. At the second step, you're looking at the task, and there should be a lot more information about the tasks than what we have here. At this step, you're literally defining the task, what should be done. The more detail you add, the better for the GenAI tools. The third step is the context. Again, you include more information to yours. But if you see what we have here, we have a bit of context. The context can be either who or what you are doing the task for. Here we are looking at the who, the client. So it can be who or what you are doing the task for. So create the content. And the final step, it's the how you want the task to be done. So the format, how it should look like. With the PTCF, the persona is who is doing the task. You go into what the task is, which is step 2. Step 3 is what or who you're doing the task for. And step 4, it's the format, how you want the task to look like or how you want the task to be done. Using the PTCF or other frameworks, there are other or structures to prompt generative AI, limits hallucination. It stops generative AI from making up information. Now that we've looked at the first practice area, let's go and actually do the practice in our workbook. The workbook that we're using for the course. So this workbook comes with a course. For each session, you have one workbook. This is for the first session. Like it says here, if you want to be able to use the workbook effectively, you have to download it, and so you can copy the prompt in the notes you will see now when I do it. Well, let's move on to the first practice. If you look in this slide 2, you will see these are the information from the other slide, so you don't need that. It's just a reminder. But if you go down here, you will see what you really need for the practice. I've already created the prompt for both approach. That is the expert and the pitfall, or how to do it and how not to do it. How to do it is at the top here. You will see all the 4 steps have been written here already. Like I said before, you should have more information in yours. You know your personnel, you know your task, you know all of that. But this is giving you the structure to follow. And this is the transcript or the notes down here that we're using for the prompt. Whereas down here is just the basic prompt, right? A proposal based on these notes, which is how not to do it. But let's run both of them and see what comes out. Then we'll talk about them. there are two Copilot opened. One of them is for how not to do it, and the other one is for how to do it. So I'm running both for how to do it and how not to do it. So let's start with the how not to do it. If you look here, that's the prompt given, and Copilot would normally say it's clean, executive ready proposal, or it sounds very generative AI sounds very confident normally. That's the usual. If we go into what's being created, because you ask for a proposal, the proposal that has been created, you will see that it has added a lot of information because you haven't given it precise information. Let's go back to our prompt. This is what the prompt said. Write a proposal based on this note. A lot has been made up here. First of all, you didn't ask for executive summary, but it knows that in the proposal there should be an executive summary, so it's made that up with some of the useful information, but a lot of information that you don't need. But what you would see, if I scroll down, you will see some sections that you probably don't need. Section 2, project scope, key risk and mitigation. Section 3, Section 4, timeline. Section 5, budget overview, staffing plan, safety commitment, return on investment. So 9 different sections. Now, this is from what generative AI knows from the internet and so on. It's made up something. It's giving you a lot of information that you did not ask for because you haven't asked for anything specifically. So what this means is that you would spend time having to edit and correct and cancel, delete. This is how generative AI goes wrong because this is not specifically for the organization that you've created it for, but it's because of the prompt. Now let's go to how to do it. If you look at a prompt of how to do it, you will see the executive summary. It focuses on specifics that you ask for. And remember, we asked for 3 areas. If I go back to the prompt, you will see the 3 areas here: executive summary, risk mitigation, and financial overview. So if you ask for 5 areas, that's what you get. If you ask for 10 different areas, that's what you get. So we have the executive summary specifically for this project. Okay, and then the risk mitigation, the same thing. This is what you ask for specifically for this project, and financial overview specifically for this project, and that's it. You get what you ask for, and it's correct. It's tailored to this project. You don't have much to edit. If this was an actual project and you've asked for, say, 6 different sections, generative AI would create those 6 different areas, and you get your document. All you have to do is just to check it, and that's it. You might have to edit a bit of it, but definitely less than 10%. So that's the first practice. You can see the difference between when you prompt it properly and when you don't. Have a quick look at this again. How are you going to use it? What are you going to use it for? It's a lot everywhere. And if you have to edit this, it would probably take you more time to edit it than just to create it from scratch, which is a problem. So that's the first practice. Let's move on to the second part of the session. Now that we've done the first practice, we are also following the same structure in the second practice. And all the different practice you have in the entire course follows the same structure. So we have the second practice in the first session now, which is precision and control. And our key term, or the key skill that you would develop in this second practice is structural architecture. What is structural architecture though? It's in this context, it's just using syntax or delimiters to instruct generative AI tools to avoid using unwanted information from the test. In other words, you have a lot of tests given to generative AI, but you want generative AI to focus on a part of that test, to use a part of that test, because if it uses other parts of the test, it might be incorrect. For example, if you have a lease agreement or a regulatory document where there's a lot of information, it might be 50 pages, but you want generative AI to focus on maybe 2 or 3 pages of that document, you can use the limiters or syntax to make generative AI focus on that part that you want it to work on. Now, the scenario, again, it's a typical workplace scenario where a transcript is being created from a meeting, but that transcript, it depends on how big the transcript is. You might not want to use the whole transcript. you might want to focus on a part of that transcript, and then you can use the limiters. But again, we're going to practice, as usual, the pitfall or how not to do it. If you look here, find the technical specs in this test. What you would get, again, would be irrelevant information. Some of the information, because you are giving the test to generative AI, you will have some of the information, but mostly you would have irrelevant information that you don't need, and you have to edit and spend a lot of time removing that information or changing it. But how do you do it properly, though? Again, as usual, we have the expert progression. The first step is necessary when there is a lot of information and you want to focus on some of it, like I've said before. But if you don't have that, if you don't have a lot of information and you don't have a part of the test that you're giving generative AI or the document you're giving generative AI, you want to use everything, you might not need the first step. But the second step is very important. It's being clear or specific about what you don't want. So you make it clear about what you don't want. Like I said before, we are very brief on the course, but you have the core. For example, we said here, exclude all administrative chatter, office humor, or non-technical mentions. So these are the things that we don't want in our content that it would create. There, you can put 5 items, 10 items, depends on what you're doing. So that's the first core step here. You start with what you don't want. Then you move on to what you want. You've already told generative AI about what you don't want. You move on to what you want. Here, we have extract, component name, value, and unit. Your context can be very different. You can have a different document in a different area, but the process is still the same. What you don't want and what you want. Once you do that, then the fourth step is one way to avoid hallucination. You instruct generative AI to use only confirmed information from the document or from the test you're giving it or from the transcript. And you ask generative AI to use a term or a word. In this case, we're using pending verification. Use pending verification if it's not confirmed, if there's no final agreement. So you can use this in any different context. Insofar as it's not confirmed in that document, or if generative AI can't confirm it, use this word. That way you're preventing generative AI from hallucinating. But having said this, let's go into the practice and see how this is in reality. So for the second practice, you can see we have the prompt that says find the technical specs in the test here, which doesn't really say much, but this one, it does something, it's an improvement from the first practice. Here, transcript is given. That means generative AI might be able to use the transcript to an extent. We'll see how that goes, but it's still not the best because it hasn't given specifics. It just says technical specs. So generative AI, we have to fill in the gap and make up stuff, as you will see now. Whereas here on the right-hand side, you have the prompt already created. As usual, I have both prompt down here. So let's start with how not to do it first, which is this one here that I'm copying now. And I will run it and we'll see what comes out and talk about it. While that one is running, I'll copy the how to do it, the expert progression, which I've already created with a prompt. If you see down here, I've done all that 4 steps down here. Okay, let's run it and see. So the first one, it gives you technical specifications. Again, it would say this is what you ask for, technical specifications, confidently, and so on. And from the tests, it is made up all of this. What is happening here? Because you've given it information to use, it's just giving you the specs. But the thing is, you can't use this because what are you going to do with the specs? This is already in that information. Some of them are not there. They just made them up. If you look here, these are the things that are in the spec. It's basically summarized it for you. But the point is, it's created what you don't want. So that means you have to type and write a lot or continue to prompt it to create what you want. Whereas on here, it's giving you exactly what you want, which is why you're doing this course, how to get exactly what you want. If you go back to the prompt, you will see you ask for the component name, you ask for the value, and you ask for the unit. So these are the things that you need to use. And then it gave you extra note. And you get exactly what you want. On this occasion, this is what it is. You don't have to do anything. So if it was a 50-page document and you need these 3 areas, that's what it would do. And you will just copy and you start with work. You use it for whatever you need it for. No editing on this occasion because of the prompt. Whereas on here, it's not clear. This is basically not useful. That's what it is. Whereas on this one, you have everything that you need the way you want it specifically. So being specific matters a lot. Now, let's move on to the third part of the session. Having done the practice for the second activity, we are moving on to the third activity. Now we are looking at the high fidelity loop. And what that is, I'll break down as we go. But the key skill that you're developing in this third practice is prompt patterning. And what that means in very simple terms is using examples to personalize or customize generative AI content. So the word prompt patterning makes it seem complex. It's not. You just give generative AI some examples to use, and that way the style of the content would align with that example that you've given generative AI. Again, we have a workplace scenario here where someone wants to write an email to the CEO, but they want the email to sound like them, and they have their own personal executive minimalist writing style. For your own writing style, you can either give generative AI some of your previous writing, and it would identify your writing style that you can then use to prompt generative AI. Or if you know your writing already, you just ask generative AI. And then again, like I said, you will add more detail than we're doing on the course. Now, it's the beginning approach, the pitfall, what not to do or how not to do it. Write a short professional email and so on about the budget. Again, you will get an email, but that email would be covered in information that you don't need, and it would be general because you haven't asked generative AI to use your own specific writing style, your tone, on those characteristics of your writing style. It will be generic. You see, this is how not to do it. But how do you do it though? The expert progression. The first step is giving generative AI the examples. Here, you can be selective. You can give it the examples that you really want to reflect what you want to create, the pattern you want to create. Here, we're just focusing on 2 areas, brevity and tone. Study the brevity and tone. But if you want more characteristics of your writing, you can ask generative AI here in the first step. And the second step is you adding the human touch with the chain of thought approach. Here we are saying first, list the 3 most critical budget figures from our Q3 report, which was the previous report. Now we're looking at creating an email for Q4 report. This makes your content human. If you do the first step and the second step, you're creating it in your own writing style. And now you're doing something that generative AI would not do normally. So here it might be to list critical figures, but if your context is different, just think, what would generative AI not do normally except I ask generative AI to do it? That's what the second step is about. And then after that, it says, second, explain why this matters to the CEO. So you're using chain of thought, do X, Y, Z, then move on to 1, 2, 3, then do ABC. When you do it that way, it has the human touch insofar as it's using your writing style. It can never look like what generative AI has done, even though it's been done by generative AI, because you've put so much of you in the process. And the third step is more human touch, basically. Now, using the style pattern and logic above, that is step 1 and step 2, draft the email to the CFO regarding the Q4 budget. You see what you've done there? You've put a lot of you in the steps 1 and 2 before doing step 3. Step 4 is the responsible GenAI check. This is the draft after GenAI has created it. You can embed this into the prompt, but sometimes it's just good for you to check it yourself at the end. And we normally advise on the course that whatever you create using generative AI, as much as you learn this prompt engineering and all the skills, you still have to check it. You can't create any content on generative AI and use it directly. I mean, checking it even helps you see how good you've become. Even if say you've created content and you've checked several times and you've seen that it's perfect, you don't need to edit anything, you still keep checking it because it's generative AI. You still keep checking it. You get to a point, you get really confident and you feel like, I don't need to check it. Nope, you always check because anything can happen and the tools, they keep changing. Now that we've talked about that, let's move into the practice for the third activity. For the third activity, you already have the scenario and the expert progress. For this activity, if information is given to generative AI, it will use that information. But if you just say to write the email for the budget without much information, it will just use what it has. For example, here, it just says to write a short professional email to the CFO about a Q4 budget for the project. Generative AI do not know about a Q4 budget. But if you give it the information about a Q4 budget, it would use that to create where you would have the content. But here, for the expert progression, I've already done the expert. You will see the steps already done here. But if you see here, I did not add the personnel. If you've already used the same generative AI thread and you've given it your personnel already, you don't need to add a personnel here. However, if you haven't, if it's the first time, then you will have to add a personnel there. Because I've used generative AI before, even though I haven't kept the thread, let's assume that it will be able to still use some of those personnel from before. And let's see what happens. While that is running, let's check the first one. Now the first one here, because you've given it a prompt to write a short professional email to the CFO about a budget, it's made up an email because it doesn't have much to work with, which is a disaster. So if you look here, it talks about cost projections, project delivery milestones. These are the general things that you would consider in a typical budget. But then when you customize or personalize it to your organization, you might not need to look at this. It just made that up because it doesn't have much to work with, which is what you shouldn't do. Whereas here is how to do it. You will see the things that we ask for specifically. 3 things that we ask for, it's been done. You don't need to edit it anymore. If you look at it, we ask for, if we go back to the prompt, first of all, it says to write a professional email and it says executive minimalist style. That's where it started. That's the task. But down here, you see what was required. First, list 3 most critical budget figures. And secondly, it says to explain why they matter to the CFO before creating the email. So that chain of thought, you've seen it here. So if you look at these and put everything in an email, send it to the CFO, and you've used your own tone, your own executive minimalist tone, you will see that it looks human. For example, the first part, let's look at it. Bullet 1, the most critical Q3 budget figures. So most people wouldn't expect the generative AI to make that up because you've given it the information, it's used it. And it also says something here. It doesn't have the report. So you just use the figures you gave it. So ideally, you should put a report there. But then without the report, with just the few notes, you have specifically the 3 areas from those notes. With a report, you will have more. And secondly, why it matters is explained. And then before the email, you can see here, you don't have to do anything. Everything is being done up to point, which is the goal. The only difference here is that you need to add a report if you want more, or if you just want to limit it to the discussions we have in a prompt, then this is what you want. Again, for the third time, you can see how specific the content is. There's no hallucination, there's no lie, there's nothing that you have to take out. The only thing you have to edit out here is just the sentence. Once you take out the sentence, you have everything already written here. It's specifically to the context what you need. You see, which is what we're trying to do. And we're trying to avoid something like this that doesn't really say anything, that is just general, which is how not to do it. Okay, let's move on to the fourth part of the session. Then we'll do the practice after that. Having practiced the third activity, we are looking at the final activity in this session, which is the responsible auditor. What is this about? Now, the key skill that you're developing in this fourth practice is the adversarial grounding. Adversarial grounding is very important when you use generative AI too. What does it mean though? It's basically how you prevent generative AI from hallucinating or making up information. We've started working around this in the last two activities, but here you will hit the nail right on the head and you stop generative AI tools from doing what you don't want. This is adversarial grounding. This is very important when you need 100% correct content. There's no room for uncertainty or for error. For example, if you're working in a regulatory environment, like the workplace scenario we're looking at here, with environmental legislation or other regulatory document or environment where the content has to be absolutely correct, no errors. Errors might lead to serious problems. And you can also use it in other areas, but we're using this core sort of example because it's very important here. How not to do it. If you look at a prompt, summarize this regulation and tell me what I need to do about noise, that would be a disaster because errors might be in there and you will have a lot of information that you don't need, which is what takes time to edit and correct the information. But how do you do it properly though? The expert progression. The first step, you're forcing generative AI to use information from the document you provide or from the website or from the source that you've given it only. That way, you start a process of ensuring that generative AI do not use extra information. And the second step, you're actually adding another layer to stop generative AI from making up information or hallucinating. You're doing the same thing, but you're doing it twice in two different ways. And you don't even stop there because remember, you're trying to create content that is 100% correct. So you have to go through several steps of adversarial grounding. In step 3, you're asking for what's not in the provided doc. The reason you're doing this is to confirm if generative AI will follow the strict limitations that you've placed in steps 1 and 2. You have the limitations there. How about if generative AI don't follow them? But you need a way to check first, is generative AI following these limitations that I've set? It might not be yours might be more than 2 steps. You might have set 3 steps or 4 steps limitations before the adversarial testing to check, would it actually follow this step? It's like an exam. If you're training generative AI to not do XYZ, but you want to check to see if it's done it. And step 4, it's an extra manual check. If you follow all these different steps, you will get 100% accurate information or content from generative AI. There won't be errors in the content. But as usual, having talked about this, let's go on to our workbook and practice it. This is the final practice in this session, the responsible auditor, as it's titled. Again, you will see the prompt here in front of you from the slide, but we focus on the note at the bottom. I've already created both prompts. Here, because we're looking at a regulation, you will have to give generative AI the regulation or the document where that regulation is written, however it's written. So you have to feed generative AI the regulation, but it's a lot more than that. But now we're not just giving generative AI the prompt because we're talking about a regulation. So how not to do it also includes giving generative AI the regulation anyways, but that can be done wrongly, which is what we are trying to show here. So here we're saying summarize this regulation and tell me what I need to do about the noise. Okay, nothing specific. It just talks about noise in general. Let's run it. This is how not to do it. Let's run it and see what happens. Here, you will see the prompt before the test. This is the test. This is a regulation. It's just a snippet of a typical regulation. The typical regulation would be a lot longer than this, as you know. Okay, but then we have the prompt here, which is the main part, but we'll just use this example from a regulation and let's run it and see the difference. Let's go to how not to do it. It's giving a summary. You see here, regulation summary, noise requirement. It talks about noise. It uses information from the regulation, which is fine, which is a good place to start. However, generative AI adds a lot more that you don't need, which means you have to edit them out. And some of them are not actually correct. If you read everything properly, you see. So this bit here, you haven't asked for. It's been made up from what you've asked. So you've asked for A, B, and generative AI added C. Imagine if you're working with a 50-page regulation and this happens. If you're getting this out of these tests, you're getting an extra paragraph out of just these tests. Imagine a 50-page regulation. You would have plenty of information that you don't need. It will just make the use of the generative AI a waste. So it wouldn't be necessary using generative AI because it will just churn out a lot of information. And within that, you will have some information that you need at the introduction of the course. We talked about that where some people said they would never use generative AI anymore. That's what happens. You see some of the things that are useful, but then there's a lot that you don't need and you have to work around making it useful. That's where the time comes in to edit and change. However, if we look at where we've prompted it properly, you can see we started with an adversarial grounding. We started with a question to check. Remember step 3. Step 3 was to check whether generative AI will follow the limitations that we've set for step 1 and step 2. And what you see here is a clear way that it would. So it answers the question that you've asked is a trick question. If you look here, where you see it from the test, answer the following question: what is the fine for data violations, which is not here. So that's what it says. It doesn't provide it. Now you know that it will follow the limitations. So it's been grounded basically. So what you do is just go back. Now that you've tried it, it's tried and tested, and remove that part of the prompt that you used to test it. Once you remove that part of the prompt, then you run it and you will get accurate information, specifically what you want. This is what you asked for. The noise limits, applicable noise limit 9 times. It's given it to you and created a small table specifically and where they came from, footnote. So this is just a basic example from a basic test from this test. Again, imagine if it was a 50-page document. All you get from that 50-page document would be what you need from the prompt that you gave it. That's all you get. You don't get more, and you don't get information that is not true. No hallucination. This is exactly what you want. This is exactly how you want to use it. And just for you to cross-check yourself, you would have the footnote that you can go back and check. And it gives you even the quote from the source. So you can check it before you use the information. You know it's accurate, but you don't need to edit it because it's giving you exactly what you want, which is the goal of this session, to ensure that you're able to prompt your generative AI and get what you want exactly without having to edit, or even if you have to edit, it's just a tiny bit of editing that you have to do. Now that we've finished practicing all 4 sessions, we are looking at the responsible generative AI matrix. In every session on this course, we look at how to use the skills learned in that session responsibly. But we also talk about how it can be used irresponsibly, just so you know to avoid that. I would summarize this. The very first part is to verify the output. We've practiced different areas and we've talked about different areas on how to verify the output. Use adversarial techniques to prevent hallucination. Do it in different steps so you're sure at the end. The second part here is to avoid imputing or using sensitive information in public generative AI tools. Instead, you focus on using the private organizational secure mode. In most of the tools, you have the organizational secure mode that you can put it into. If you're not sure how to do it, just Google how to make it secure or private organizational mode. That's the second part. The third part is to avoid imprecise prompts and use delimiters and give generative AI specific guidance. Generative AI needs a lot of guidance, especially when you start using it for something new. When you guide it, say the first few times, once generative AI gets it, you'll be shocked how well it continues to create the same thing. But it needs that guidance at the beginning. First, second, third. If you've used the right prompt and you've guided it properly, by the third time you're getting excellent content. You wouldn't need to do much. You just repeat the process and continue. The fourth one is to avoid using generative AI for generic emails, basically, or other content. So you can use a few short examples, chain of thought logic that we've covered to personalize the content, the emails. And the fifth part is to avoid vague prompts. So you can use a structure like the PTCF. There are other structures, but the PTCF works really well. So your prompt is not vague, it's structured. And the last part, the sixth part, is to double check key details, especially technical details, after. Doing all of these would ensure you're using your generative AI tools excellently and responsibly, and you wouldn't have all the irresponsible issues that we hear of in industry. For this course, you have two assessments. The first one is the self-assessment, which you assess yourself after each session. And how do you do it? You look for a scenario. We have 4 workplace scenarios in this first session. You look for a scenario that is similar to yours, and you adapt it to suit your own workplace activities, what you do. Then you edit the expert progression for that scenario before you run the prompt in generative AI tools. Then you compare the output that you've created following these steps and having learned this with what you used to create before. You will see the clear difference. The other assessment that we have is at the end of the course. When you finish all 7 sessions, we have a test. Once you pass the test, you will get a certificate to show that you've learned generative AI usage and you've become an expert in terms of using generative AI tools, and that can be confirmed. So there will be a link to confirm the certificate online by employers and so on, and you can put that on your LinkedIn anyways. But that's at the end of the course. Now, what happens next? In the next session, we're looking at information architecture and knowledge management. This session is to transform you, the learner, from consumer of information to architecting knowledge, creating knowledge from information. So you have all of this information at your disposal, but you're creating knowledge out of it. And we're really focusing on big data, big organizational data, how you clean them, how you organize them, how you retrieve them, and how you link them together, synthesize them, creating different resources from them. We'll create a few resources in the session, but after that, you will be able to use that to do more. As part of that session, we ensure that the sources that you use are truthful sources, because you will prompt generative AI to confirm. So you're not just using any source. That's what we are doing next. This session has been created to be suitable for different work scenarios. But if your work scenarios, it's very unique that the whole session doesn't apply to you, or most of the session doesn't apply to you, then you can reach out to us where we create a specific session for you using your own workflows, your activities, and your scenarios. So it's tailored to your needs. But that's it for the first session of the Generative AI Mastery course. I look forward to seeing you in the second session. Thanks and bye for now.